Thank you so much for staying at the end of this symposium, and thank you for the organizers to bring us here together. I'm going to be speaking about the state of digital humanities across borders, like right in the U.S. Mexico border, but also transnational interactions that we are facing as working with collaborations in Latin America or working with topics that are interconnected between the United States and other countries. I want to start by sharing this with you all and just see what kind of digital approach will you take on this newspaper. What are some of the methodologies, the topics, the interventions that you will take if you were tasked to work with that particular newspaper? So in here we're seeing several methodologies that can be applied from the categorization, for instance, illegal aliens, right? Aliens, the year, and how a lot of these keywords have been creating stereotypes of a particular community that as digital humanists, we have some roles to intervene, either in replicating these stereotypes or in expanding and contextualizing the data that is behind this type of newspapers. So with that, I want to start. I'm going to show you some projects that took me to understand the importance and the role that digital humanities has in transnational and transborder situations, and how this has been a process of learning of the different aspects that are involved in this kind of work. In 2017, I started, and I actually was invited here to one of the Global Digital Humanities to talk about Borderlands Archives Cartography. This is a project that started in 2017 as an independent and autonomous project. I created that project together with a colleague, Mayra. We were graduate students. This project didn't have any funding, any resources, and we didn't come from a background of, we were coming from a background of literature and archives. At that point, there was also the political rhetoric of our current president, targeting the U.S. Mexico border as dangerous, where criminals were crossing all the time. So it was important to revisit that rhetoric and think about possibilities to work with that kind of information. With that project involved putting together a transborder newspaper archive, but it was a challenge making that archive. Why? Because a lot of the newspapers that are related to the U.S. Mexico border are categorized in a way that you don't see a connection between the U.S. Mexico. You see a division. If you just go to the archive and look for these newspapers, they're under United States or Mexico. But you never see any keywords that will allow you to see that this project, that these newspapers were in conversation, that these newspapers maybe exist on both sides of the border. So approaching this kind of archives, I started noticing a lot of the colonial violence that exists in archives and categorizations that are now represented in algorithms, in artificial intelligence about how the US-Mexico border works. So approaching this kind of data was to start looking at different repositories on both sides of the US-Mexico border and start seeing which newspapers were published in the border region through a historical lens from 1808 to 1930 due to copyrights. So engaging with that, it was possible to start seeing a big production of newspapers that were in conversation, that at some historical moment were published in the north of Mexico, but they had to cross to the US and then started publishing in the US due to like the Mexican Revolution, for instance. Or that some of these newspapers were published in what was Mexico at some point in the United States. So how do you dig in with those historical periods that shape what has been and what is the US Mexico border? So through that was my first engagement with digital humanities and Borderlands data. And the cartography was the possibility to visualize the geopolitical movement, but also to start questioning why we don't have access to a lot of these archives that are talking about a united and not a separated border. Why? What are some of the possibilities to start understanding how communities have been interacting since colonial times to the present in this region, rather than fomenting a categorization of newspapers that will make us invisibilize this relationship? So approaching cartography at this point was questioning also how digital tools about mapping also impose geopolitical divisions. And we were even thinking about disobeying these mapping platforms with this simple situation of erasing the line about the US Mexico border when it didn't exist in 1808, right? And moving the line accordingly to the historical period in order to understand how these newspapers have moved across borders during that time. So with that, it was important to start seeing the limitations and the possibilities to create a new understanding of this transborder, transnational region through archival material. Another aspect that was observed within this project was the inequality about how the archives are in Mexico and in the United States. A lot of these newspapers are here in the United States. When they speak about a Mexican history, the New Spain history, how that limits you to understand the history that it's being taught in Mexico with archives here in the United States that share a same history. So within this project, it was possible to start thinking about these possibilities about how digital humanities can intervene in the colonial violence of archives. And as you can see, a lot of what influence was feminist theorists from the border that have been discussing a lot of this work. In this case, how Gloria Anzaldúa, one of the Borderlands feminists, has always been thinking about bringing these border personal experiences to academic work. So Borderlands Archives Cartography started with a personal interest of creating something that could expand the understanding of a border region where people live and where people moves back and forth throughout history. So with that, in 2017, 2018, another aspect of understanding transborder, transnational digital humanities was possible with two projects. One of them, the Delis Negron Digital Archive, that it's an institutional project, but that it was donated by a family that wanted to highlight the story of Delis Negron, who was a Puerto Rican that established in Nuevo Laredo and Laredo and started translating and directing newspapers. We never knew about this history in Thank you. We never knew about this history in the borderlands because of what I just mentioned, right? How data is so controlled to tell us just one story about. And a lot of this archival material was in the attic of the Liz Negron house, who never was aware of the importance of the cultural and literary heritage that was part of, of the borderlands. This project was created with commercial digital platforms in order for the family to continue adding and working with that work. Apart Separados was a project, an independent project that is telling us the story of just from the immigration in the family separation from the U.S. side. So thinking about this single stories, we only see data from the U.S. side. And what is happening? That we're missing the other side of immigration because of the lack of data in order to talk about how migration is a transnational issue, how the Liz Negron was writing on both sides of was translating on both sides. So there is also this aspect in transnational and transborder digital humanities about thinking of ways to tell a complete story rather than a single story that can foment stereotypes that have been carried out throughout history. So looking ahead with, in 2019, thinking about ways to put together both sides of the border and understanding the state of digital humanities. Sometimes many activists and communities don't call it digital humanities. It was the intention to localize digital projects, digital materials from both sides to understand how the U.S. Mexico was represented in the digital record. This project, it was possible to create a symposium to hear more about the process, about the intentions, about the loss of data of many of these projects from both sides, and also to start reviewing these projects for people to know about this work. Through that, within digital and transborder and transnational digital humanities, it resonates that it is important to take both sides or to be clear why we're specifying in just one side, because of the lack of data, because of the state of newspapers or archives that are not digitized, that cannot be visualized. But it's so important to clarify that because of the story that is being transmitted. With United Fronteras, we also started exploring minimal computing and also thinking about how minimal computing is an important role in the technologies that are being used in transborder and transnational projects, pushing for technologies that can represent related or multilingual representations rather than just one single stories in one language. We did use WAX, and WAX was a challenge because at that point, that all the structure wasn't designed to do it bilingual. It was only to do it in one language. So we had to figure it out a way to do it bilingual and represent that situation in the border. So just to wrap up, throughout this, since 2017 throughout those years, it was possible to start observing different main aspects of what was transborder and transnational digital humanities and what can be. One of the situations, it's starting right now with the support of the Mellon Foundation and the Responsible Computing Challenge with the Mozilla, to establish a Transborder Digital Humanities Center and Consortium to start pushing for projects that can tell a complete story rather than a single story, to create digital tools that can reflect these realities in the world rather than limiting us to representations only where we're at, but moving to represent that movement. Another aspect that aims with the Transborder DH is also to make collaborations and partnerships across the world in order to face what is happening of the lack of citations, of the lack of inequalities with funding in the United States as perceived as the global north and the global south, for instance. And one example of this is what Walter Mignolo, Rupika Rizam have been talking about the possibility to intervene. I'm just going to take a last minute to finish with that. In order to approach that in Transborder and transnational digital humanities, it's so important to consider the geopolitical movement throughout history. A lot of the political treaties that have influenced countries that determine how we access data in archives in the past and in the present, and about pushing us to teach translingually and multilingually and across disciplines with material from across the world rather than not just what is here in the United States. To create new data, and I'm going to pass this one, and to also create solidarity and collaborations. This is a project that in Mexico, there was a group in Mexico that wanted to document a feminist movement, but the institution didn't want it to support. So there was a collaboration here in the United States with the University of Kansas to host that project here. So we're speaking also about this kind of workflows and methodologies to solidarize and collaborate across borders. Another example is working with indigenous communities in border regions in Latin America, where at one point it was the idea to use Mukurtu, because it's a platform designed for indigenous communities. But this platform doesn't work in Latin America, in regions that there's no internet connection, right? So it's so important to think about across borders with an understanding about the inequalities and the needs to design things that are work in connection across the world. So with that, these are some of the pressing issues in transborder transnational work. Thank you.